Thousands died in the first months. The revolution did not bring a pause, it brought a firing squad. Behind the image of the liberator who defied the West stood the architect of a systematic terror machine. How does a savior's face transform into a state apparatus of fear? Through cold, calculated elimination. Khomeini's rise triggered brutal purges across every level of society. The new government did not negotiate, it executed. Mass executions became the standard tool for stabilizing the regime. By 1988, the number of political prisoners killed in a single summer reached several thousand. The state operated like a factory. Orders were signed, necks were broken. Then came the conflict with Iraq. It was not just a border dispute, it was a demographic meatball grinder. Khomeini used the war to cement his grip on power at home while sending children to clear minefields. 8 years of slaughter followed. 1 million people died. An entire generation disappeared into the desert sand. The technological foundation for this terror was recorded on magnetic tape in 1970 in the Najaf, Iraq. It began with a legal breaking point. In 1964, the Shah's government passed the capitulation law. It granted American military personnel absolute legal immunity on Iranian soil. Khomeini saw a breach in the system. He declared the law a surrender of national sovereignty. The response was immediate. In November 1964, security forces arrested Khomeini and forced him into exile. His first stop was Bursa, Turkey. The Turkish authorities stripped him of his clerical identity. He was forbidden from wearing traditional robes in public. Every movement remained under constant surveillance. The environment was restrictive. But Bursa was only a transit point. In 1965, Khomeini moved to Najaf. This was the heart of the Shiite world, home to the shrine of Ali ibn Abi Talib. In the shadow of the first imam, the exiled cleric found a laboratory for his radical software. Here he began to lecture. He formulated a doctrine to override 1,000 years of tradition. Velayat-e Faqih, the guardianship of the Islamic jurist. For centuries, Shiite theology held a specific position. True leadership would only return with the hidden 12th imam. Until then, clerics stayed out of direct governance. Khomeini hacked this logic. He argued that waiting for the 12th imam while corrupt rulers reigned was a systemic error. His solution: senior scholars must seize direct political power. The logistics of this ideological infection were precise. A student sat in the lecture hall. He reached out. A mechanical click of the tape recorder button signaled the start. Khomeini spoke, and the reels turned. These master tapes were then duplicated hundreds of times in secret basements. The cassettes and printed booklets became the primary weapons of the coming coup. Underground networks of clerics smuggled the recordings across the border, in suitcases and under floorboards. By 1979, these tapes had synchronized the pulse of a nation. The distribution network moved thousands of recordings through the shadow economy of the Iranian bazaars. The revolutionary tapes synchronized the pulse of a nation, but the hardware for this collapse was installed decades earlier. The systemic crisis began in the dust of the Qajar dynasty. September 24, 1902, Ruhollah Khomeini is born in the town of Khomeini. He is the son of a local cleric, Mustafa Musavi. Within months, the father is dead, killed on a road between towns. The boy grows up in a house of mourning and strict ritual. His mother and aunt dictate his reality. Religion is not a choice. It is the only available language. Why did the nation eventually trade its freedom for a clerical blade? The economy already belonged to strangers. In the markets of Khomeini, the air is thick with the smell of raw wool and resentment. Men huddle in the shadows of the bazaar. They talk of the Qajar Shahs. They talk of weakness. By the early 20th century, Iran is a shell, a vacuum. The Russian Empire and the United Kingdom slice the map into spheres of influence. Foreigners own the banks. Foreigners run the telegraphs. The Qajar rulers trade the country's future for palace luxuries. Young Khomeini listens to the complaints in the mosques. He hears the same word repeated: capitulation. The people watch as their borders blur and their resources vanish. The monarchy signs away the nation's oil. It hands trade privileges to London and St. Petersburg. Sovereignty is auctioned off in pieces. The hatred for British corporations demanded a legal foundation. Khomeini engineered it in 1943. He wrote a manifesto titled Kashf al-Asrar, the unveiling of secrets. For over a millennium, the Shiite clergy followed a strict code of silence. They stayed in the shadows of the mosques. They guided souls, not states. Khomeini dismantled this theological consensus in a single volume. He did not just defend the faith, he weaponized it. Khomeini sat at a wooden desk. The dry rustle of classic parchment filled the room. He was not reading the ancient texts, he was rewriting them. He deleted the tradition of passivity. He inserted the duty of rebellion. Secular thinkers were no longer just opponents, they were targets. The ink on these pages in 1943 would eventually turn into the blood of a revolution. Decades later, these same theoretical lines would form the skeletal structure of a total police state. The blueprint was ready. He attacked the very idea of Western-style governance. To Khomeini, a secular law was a dangerous infection. He argued that Islamic law must be the only pilot of the state. If a ruler was un-Islamic, the clergy had a divine mandate to topple him. He stayed in the seminaries of Qom. He taught philosophy. He lectured on law. Slowly, he handpicked a dense network of loyal students. The analytical apparatus for such tracks was not born in a vacuum. It was calibrated starting in 1920 within the rigid isolation of the Qom seminaries. Where does the architecture of a future coup assemble? It happens in the absolute silence of libraries. Khomeini moved to Qom just as it transformed into a theological powerhouse. Abdul Karim Hayati Yazdi had recently founded the modern seminary there. It was a closed circuit, a laboratory for Sharia. Khomeini transitioned from a student to a systematic processor of information. He mastered Arabic grammar, Quranic interpretation, and advanced Islamic law. The regime was academic, the discipline was total. Khomeini studied under Yazdi, absorbing the mechanics of jurisprudence and mysticism. He was not a firebrand yet. He was a technician of the soul. He spent his days deconstructing classical texts and his nights writing dense academic notes. Qom acted as an incubator, processing thousands of loyal theologians into a unified cadre. Before the first protest, there were decades of grueling mental labor, thousands of hours. Khomeini spent them buried in medieval legal codes and complex ethics. He read until the oil lamps flickered out. He memorized until the logic of the state and the logic of God became indistinguishable. He taught small classes. He remained a quiet instructor. Outside the religious walls, no one knew his name. September 8, 1978. Tehran, Jaleh Square. The government declared martial law only hours earlier. Most protesters in the square did not know. Others did not care. Thousands stood packed between the concrete walls, chanting against the monarchy. Then, the perimeter closed. Soldiers moved into position. Boot heels clicked on the pavement. The dry crack of army rifles shattered the air, echoing off the buildings. No warning shots. The troops fired directly into the mass of people. How did a record-breaking oil boom lead to a street massacre? The answer lay in the math of the Iranian treasury. While oil revenues hit historic peaks, inflation liquidated the wages of the poor. Wealth pooled at the top. The bottom of society lived in a vacuum of debt and unemployment. This economic gap was guarded by Savak. The Shah's secret police did not just monitor dissent, they engineered fear. They operated a network of interrogation centers. Students, journalists, and activists disappeared into these cells. Human rights groups later documented systematic torture. By 1978, the pressure inside the system exceeded its structural limits. The explosion started in Tabriz and Isfahan. It reached the capital by September. On that morning in Jaleh Square, the state's security apparatus suffered a total systemic overload. Bodies fell. People scrambled for cover in the red chaos. The military killed 88 people in a single morning. Opposition groups claimed the number was closer to several hundred. This statistical rift ended any hope for a political solution. The massacre transformed the protest from a riot into a war of attrition. The official death toll remains a matter of fierce debate, but on that Friday, the bridge to compromise was burned. The economic imbalance that led to the street massacres of 1978 started decades earlier. In 1925, Reza Shah Pahlavi seized power and ended the Qajar dynasty. He demanded speed. He wanted a modern state carved out of a feudal landscape. Reza Shah launched a forced industrialization. He built the Trans-Iranian Railway, a massive engineering feat connecting the Persian Gulf to the Caspian Sea. He expanded the army. He replaced Islamic courts with Western legal systems and stripped religious authorities of their traditional influence. Inside the seminaries of Qom, a young scholar named Ruhollah Khomeini watched from the shadows. At that time, few outside the religious world even knew his name. But the new infrastructure had a fatal flaw. It made Iran a strategic prize. In 1941, the calculus of World War II crushed the Shah's neutrality. Great Britain and the Soviet Union needed a corridor to transport American supplies. They needed Iranian oil. The invasion was swift. Foreign boots hit Iranian soil to secure the very railways Reza Shah had built for independence. The Trans-Iranian Railway became the bridge to victory for the Allies, but a symbol of humiliation for Tehran. The transport hubs that the Shah designed for sovereignty were the exact reason the great powers took it away. The occupation broke the monarchy's spine. Reza Shah was forced to abdicate and fled into exile. In 1941, his son, Mohammad Reza Shah Pahlavi, took the throne under the shadow of foreign bayonets. In 1941, the Shah took a throne built on foreign interests. 2 decades later, he attempted to reclaim control through social engineering. In 1963, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi launched the White Revolution. It was a massive top-down restructuring of Iranian society. The mechanics were simple. The state began the compulsory redistribution of large estates. Education programs targeted rural illiteracy. Women received the right to vote. On paper, it was progress. In practice, the rustle of government land transfer decrees signaled the end of a centuries-old social order. Why did progressive reforms trigger a violent revolt? Land redistribution directly liquidated the financial base of the Shia clergy. The religious establishment saw an existential threat. In the holy city of Qom, a high-ranking cleric named Ruhollah Khomeini began a systematic verbal assault on the monarchy. The escalation peaked in June 1963, during the mourning period of Ashura. Khomeini stood before the crowds and accused the Shah of betraying Islam to serve Western powers. The reaction was algorithmic. The speech reached the streets. Within 48 hours, Tehran, Mashhad, and Shiraz descended into chaos. This was the 15 Khordad uprising. Security forces deployed with live ammunition. They opened fire on the demonstrators. Bodies filled the streets. The government suppressed the riots and immediately arrested Khomeini. The state security apparatus officially entered his name into the files of high-priority political opponents. In October 1978, the world's attention shifted to a quiet French suburb, Neauphle-le-Château. A village of stone houses and silence became the headquarters of a revolution. Here, an elderly cleric in a black turban sat under an apple tree and dismantled a monarchy. Global media flocked to him. BBC, CNN, and Le Monde turned a village garden into a world stage. The logistics were clinical. Khomeini recorded his speeches on magnetic tape. These masters were duplicated by the thousands. Then came the smuggling. Listen to the sound of the revolution. It wasn't just shouting. It was the magnetic hiss of contraband cassette tapes. They moved through bazaars and into the hearts of every mosque. In Tehran, the Shah's censors were powerless against a pocket-sized plastic tape. One recording could paralyze a city. By December, the strategy shifted from words to economic suffocation. The Iranian oil industry, The regime's jugular vein simply stopped. Strike committees froze the refineries. Production plummeted from 6 million barrels a day to nearly zero. The state was bleeding out. The Shah's financial heart had stopped beating. On January 16, 1979, the inevitable arrived. Mohammad Reza Pahlavi walked toward his silver Boeing 707. He carried a small box of Iranian soil. Officially, it was a vacation for medical rest. Reality was different. The King of Kings was fleeing his own country. 2 weeks later, the air over Mehrabad Airport changed. February 1, 1979, an Air France charter touched down. Khomeini stepped onto the tarmac after 14 years of exile. Millions of people flooded the streets of Tehran. They climbed rooftops. They choked the highways. They wept for a victory they thought was theirs. The streets were loud, but the halls of power remained contested. The coalition of liberals, Marxists, and clerics had won the first battle. Yet the true war for the soul of the state was just beginning. Khomeini and his inner circle were already preparing the next phase of the purge. 4,000 to 5,000 prisoners, executed in a few weeks. The euphoria of the revolution had long evaporated. By the summer of 1988, the Islamic Republic was bleeding from an 8-year war with Iraq. The economy was a wreck. The public was exhausted. Inside the walls of Evin and Gohardasht, thousands of political detainees waited. Some had already finished their sentences. They remained behind bars anyway. How to process thousands of people through a tribunal in just weeks? Build a death conveyor. The leadership formed secret judicial cells. Prisoners called them the death committees. A young prosecutor named Ibrahim Raisi sat on the panel. Decades later, he would become the president of Iran. In 1988, he was a technician of the purge. The process was industrial. One prisoner, one chair, 1 minute. Raisi asked the questions. Do you renounce the opposition? Do you support the Islamic Republic? A hesitation was a death warrant. A wrong answer ended the file. The committee marked the folder and signaled the guards. The logistics were flawless. Prisoners walked from the interrogation room straight to the execution halls. No appeals, no lawyers. In the secret wings of Evin prison, the rhythmic thud of falling bodies echoed through the corridors. The gallows worked without pause. The machine consumed hundreds of lives every day. It was not a riot. It was a bureaucratic procedure. Families waited at the gates. They received no news. Weeks later, officials handed over plastic bags containing the personal effects of the dead. Watches, rings, glasses. They banned public mourning. They forbade funeral ceremonies. The state scrubbed the records. No official execution lists exist. Guards buried the bodies in mass, unmarked trenches in the Kavarin cemetery. The government never released the burial maps. The foundation for the industrial slaughter of 1988 was poured 9 years earlier. In April 1979, the first Islamic revolutionary tribunals began their work. These were not courts. They were engineering prototypes for a machine of mass elimination. The mechanics were simple. A cleric sat as judge. No defense attorneys, no evidence review, no right to appeal. The process stripped away centuries of legal tradition in minutes. Official facade, a quest for revolutionary justice. Actual mechanic, a death sentence issued in the time it takes to read an indictment. The system prioritized speed over law. Amir Abbas Hoveyda had led the Iranian government as prime minister for 13 years. He was the longest-serving official in the monarchy's history. The judicial machine digested his entire life, issued a verdict, and ended him in a matter of hours. On April 7, 1979, the tribunal found him guilty of spreading corruption on earth. He was one of many. Generals, police chiefs, and cabinet ministers disappeared into the cells of Qasr prison. Executioners worked through the night. The state offered no final goodbyes or official notifications. Families learned their relatives were dead from the morning radio broadcasts. After the generals fell, the judicial conveyor belt demanded more fuel. By 1981, The machine turned on its own. The alliance that broke the Shah dissolved into a civil war of shadows. In June 1981, the tensions snapped. A massive explosion ripped through the headquarters of the Islamic Republican Party. 72 officials died in the blast. Among the bodies was Mohammad Beheshti, the revolution's chief architect and the second most powerful man in Iran. The state blamed the People's Mojahedin Organization, the MEK. They were former brothers in arms who now became the ultimate internal enemy. The response was industrial. Security forces launched nationwide sweeps. They didn't just target the bombers, they went after the students, the leftists, and the secular activists who had stood on the barricades just 2 years prior. The logistics of terror hit a bottleneck. Prisons designed for hundreds now held thousands. In the cells, the air grew thick and stagnant. Prisoners slept in shifts because the concrete floors lacked the square footage for everyone to lie down at once. Confessions were extracted through systematic brutality. Guards used cables, electric shocks, and total sleep deprivation. Those who survived the interrogations faced secret tribunals that lasted minutes. By the end of the year, the state had processed and imprisoned several thousand people. By the late 1980s, the prison cells remained packed with thousands of dissidents. But the man who designed this machine was physically falling apart in a Tehran clinic. The biological resource of Ruhollah Khomeini had finally reached its limit. He was 86. Years of revolution and a decade of total war had hollowed out his body. In May 1989, surgeons in Tehran opened the leader to stop severe intestinal bleeding. The sterile ward smelled of antiseptics and old age. Could the death of the architect in June 1989 stop the repression? No. The mechanism no longer needed its creator. Inside the operating room, the monitors showed a steady collapse. Doctors fought to stabilize the heart. It failed. On June 3, 1989, Khomeini was pronounced dead. State media broadcast the news instantly. Dry medical reports of intestinal hemorrhaging and cardiac arrest played against a backdrop of organized mass mourning. For millions, a saint had fallen. For others, a tyrant had vanished. The streets filled with black cloth and ritual grief. Yet behind the high walls of Evin prison, nothing changed. The lists of targets were already printed. The executioners knew their shifts. The bureaucracy of the Islamic Republic had achieved perfect autonomy. Khomeini was gone, but the machine of terror continued to work.